parts, and in the first part I'm just going to talk about some studies in reading aloud using mass priming and some computational simulations of the reading aloud data. And in the second part of my talk, I'm just going to talk about the limitations of current computational models of single word reading and how my current work aims to address these limitations. Now, as you have said, I'm at Royal Holloway. I work with Cathy Rastall, but my work is funded by the British Academy, and I'm also an associate investigator of the CCD Centre, which is at Macquarie University in Sydney. So the work that I will be presenting today is consists of some studies that I did at CCD when I was a PhD student there. Back then it was called MAX. And some other studies that I did last year when I went back as a postdoc for a few months. So just a little bit of my background. Throughout my PhD, I investigated the cognitive processes that underlie skilled reading at the single word level. And fortunately, most theories of single word reading are now computationally implemented. And that's a big advantage because they are explicit and testable. So throughout my PhD, I conducted several behavioral experiments with skilled adult readers. They were specifically designed to test, further develop, refine, and falsify the available computational models of single word reading. Now, I have to say that I used to refer to these models as computational models of reading, but then Simon rightly pointed out at my EPS talk in Bangor that this is incorrect and shouldn't be talking about computational models of reading when these models can only do single word reading. Therefore, I've changed the terminology. And so today I'm just going to refer to them as computational models of single word reading. Now, some people say that computational models are like toothbrushes because everybody's got his own and nobody wants to use somebody else's. To some extent this is true because I did my PhD at Max Kolka's lab, and that's where the DRC model was developed, and so I mainly use the DRC model as a basis to do my studies. But I also extensively use the CDP Plus model, and the reason for that is because this model is also publicly available as a DRC model, so you can go to the website, download it, and test your hypothesis. Of course, the hypotheses that I tested have theoretical implications for other models of reading as well, so the triangle model. The reason why I didn't run any simulations with triangle models is because, first of all, they're not publicly available, so you basically have to build your own model in order to run any simulations. And also, there are many versions of these models, so each different version has been used to simulate different data sets, and so it's much more difficult to go and build a different version every time you want to simulate a set of data. So, as I said before, in the first part of my talk, I'll be talking about computational model and reading aloud, and in the second part, I'll talk about the limitations, some of the limitations of present models and how I'm trying to address them. Okay, so the reading aloud studies that I'm going to be talking about today all have used the mass priming paradigm, and I suspect that most of you are familiar with this paradigm. So basically, in this paradigm, you present a series of hash marks for about 500 milliseconds. These are then replaced by the prime stimulus, which is presented for between 30 and 60 milliseconds, typically for 50 milliseconds. And the prime is then replaced by the target, which is displayed until participants make a response to it. Now, in this paradigm, because the prime is presented so briefly, participants cannot see it or report it. But the subliminal processing of the prime usually has an influence on participants' responses to the target. So mass priming studies have consistently shown that skilled readers can process semantic, orthographic, morphological, and phonological properties of mass primes outside of awareness. And these studies have all significantly improved our understanding of the complex machinery underlying our reading system. Now, in particular, I used a phenomenon called the masked onset priming effect. And the paradigm here is the same. You present a series of hash marks for 500 milliseconds replaced by the prime, then replaced by the target, and you ask participants to read aloud the target as quickly as they can. You say nothing about the prime. And what is typically found in this paradigm is that participants' target naming latencies are faster when the prime and the target start with the same sound, as in SAF-SIG, compared to when the prime and the target start with different sounds. And the way this effect has been explained is that unconscious processing of the first phoneme of the prime exerts an influence on the speed of processing of the first phoneme of the target. Now, of course, the question is, why do we investigate this empirical phenomenon? Well, it is generally agreed among reading theorists that two procedures are involved in the translation of photography to phonology. One is restricted to whole word information, and the other includes or specializes in subword information. But the nature of processing in the orthography to phonology translation is still under debate. So models such as the DRC model and the CDP Plus model consist of two routes. There is a lexical route, which supports the reading aloud of words with atypical orthography to phonology mapping, such as pint and yacht, and this route operates in parallel. And there is also a non-lexical route which supports the reading aloud of novel or unfamiliar words, such as sab, for example. And this route operates serially from left to right. Now, in the triangle model, the orthographic input representations are translated into the phonological output representation solely in parallel. And so the reason why we investigate the mode is because it's been said that it's an empirical phenomenon which has been offered as evidence for serial processing and reading aloud. And therefore it is suitable for adjudicating between the two theoretical approaches to reading. So the dual root account of the MOE was originally proposed by Faust and Davies back in '91, and it was then implemented in the DRC model. So how does DRC explain this effect? Well, the prime is presented very briefly. Now, in the computation model, it's presented for a certain number of cycles, for a few number of cycles. The non-lexical route has time to process only its first letter and translate it into its corresponding phoneme down here. And then the target replaces the prime. The prime's letters are switched off, but its activation at the phoneme level remains. And so when the target comes in, if the prime and the target start with the same phoneme, the target's first phoneme has been pre-activated by the prime, therefore it's going to be named faster compared to when it's preceded by a completely unrelated prime.
So, you know, when you're doing this,
yep.
it seems from your examples that the second letter, which is a vowel in these,
yep.
it's always a different sounding. The phonologist says that the vowel's different.
Yeah.
And I'm assuming you're doing that on purpose, right? Is that right?
Yes. So that's it has been. I'll then talk about an experiment where you look at the first two sounds are the same. But yeah, the typical when people refer to this mode is when you just have the first sound,
first letter,
and sound.
Yeah. So, yeah. I mean, in the way we're describing it there, it's like, well, look, you know, the S has a chance to get into the phoneme system. Why doesn't S have a chance to get in?
Well, because you present, the way it has been explained is that because what influencing, I mean, people have, I'll go through that, so you're doing it in the next slide.
Okay, right.
But it's just the first letter that makes the difference,
Okay.
and therefore prime for X number of cycles so that only its first
Okay.
letter is going to make it to the phoneme level. But I'm just going to talk about this now. Now, of course, if you think about it, theories which suggest that the orthography to phonology mapping occurs in parallel would also be able to explain this effect. Because even if the prime was processed in parallel, any phoneme overlap between the prime and the target should yield faster naming latencies compared to no phoneme overlap. So actually this effect per se does not provide evidence against parallel processing. And so a different experiment needs to be done in order to adjudicate between the two theories. And so this experiment was done by Kinoshita in 2000. And so she had these conditions where the prime and the target start with the same letter, the same phoneme, or they start with the first two letters are the same, the prime and the target, and you've got the unrelated condition. But also she included this condition where the prime and the target share the last letter, or they share the last two letters, or they have no letters in common. And so if the orthography to phonology translation occurs in parallel, there should be some priming in these two conditions compared to the unrelated condition, right? But there was no priming in this condition. And so this experiment pretty much corroborated the assumption that the reason why the MOB occurs is because there is a non-lexical serial mechanism that operates from left to right. So is that clear? Yeah. So the DRC model which implements this non-lexical serial mechanism can obviously simulate these data.
Okay, I'm going to quibble with you though, because
Yeah.
even though that pattern might be reliable,
Yeah.
there's clearly a trend there in the right direction, right?
Yeah, there is a trend in the right direction, and I actually replicated this experiment myself, and I found a 3 millisecond difference that turned out to be significant in my data. And of course, you can tweak the parameters of the model, you can make the prime duration longer to get the effect you want, but then you don't get the other mass also priming effects with the model. So this difference was actually 3 milliseconds in the Kinoshita data. It turned out to be non-significant. In my data, it was significant. So I'm not really sure if we try to do this experiment again, I don't know if we would find this difference. But yeah, at least the two studies were consistent in the sense that it was in the right direction, like they both agreed. Now, with computational modeling, sometimes you just have a particular hypothesis and you go out, you do the experiment and you test it. But there are many cases where you get certain predictions from the models. And so the models make a particular prediction and so you decide to go and do the experiment and verify if the model's prediction is right. And that was the case in this study. This was actually accidental that we saw that the models were showing this effect. Basically, what you see here is that the primes are real words, and what the models show is this is DRC and this is CDP plus, is that apart from this condition, which is the standard ONSIP-related condition, the models show that when the prime and the target are real words and they share the last letter, target naming latencies are going to be faster compared to a completely unrelated condition. And when we try to understand why the models were doing that, we ran the simulations, and the reason for that was because when the primes are real words, they're activated because of their frequency, they're activated very quickly in the orthographic lexicon. So actually the effect comes from the lexical root. They're activated very quickly, flat gets activated, best comes in, it boosts the activation of best, and best is named faster compared to when the prime has no letters in common with the target.
So that's basically one letter overlap, isn't it?
Yeah, just the last one. Yeah.
I suppose a 25% overlap.
Yeah.
Okay.
So anyway, so we thought, okay, well, if humans show this effect, then we're famous. So we went and tested the model's prediction, and it turns out that people do not show that. So people show exactly the same effects in the two conditions. So basically, there's no facilitation in the unrelated condition. This was DRC, and this was CDP plus. So obviously the models are wrong, and I wrote up this paper, I submitted it, and it got rejected because it's not theoretical enough. And so I'm now reworking on it, and I'm going to try to resubmit it. But the whole idea was just to say that although these models can simulate everything else, here's an effect that they cannot simulate. But the reviewers didn't like it.
Where did you send it?
I sent it to HPP.
And who handled it?
Jonathan Ranger. I mean, the reviews comments were quite positive. They said it's very well written and everything, but they said that it's not theoretical. So this was okay. So this is another study now. Now, of course, as I said, this is the Giroud account of the mode, and what the Giroud account of the mode says is that the reason why the effect occurs is because of the phoneme overlap between the prime and the target, the first phoneme overlap. So what this account says is that the effect is phonological in nature. But how do we know that people show this effect because of the common phoneme overlap? It could also be the common letter, right? So we don't really know, and this is why we went and did the experiment to find out. This is the experiment that we did. This is what DRC predicted. So you've got primes and targets that start with the same letter, same phoneme, primes and targets that start with the same phoneme but a different letter, and an unrelated condition. We did this experiment and we found the same effect. So we were very happy with that. The effect is phonological in nature, and exactly the same experiment was done in Dutch using the same paradigm, and they also found that the effect is phonological in nature.
Okay, fair enough. But you can only do that for one letter, can't you?
Yes. So in Dutch it was with C and S as well.
Okay.
It was done with two. The other thing that I tried to do was PH and F.
And does that work?
No,
No, because there's two
it's
letters.
two letters. Yeah. So it didn't work. But yeah, I guess for example in Spanish you could do it with V and B. Yeah. That would be another way to do it. Now we were very pleased with this finding because the other thing is that the other thing that I didn't mention is that the reason why the effect arises in the CDP plus model is because of the common letter. So that was a very nice way to adjudicate between DRC, the DRC explanation of the effect, and the CDP plus explanation of the effect. Then we asked this question. This is the title of the paper. Now what this is all about is that generally there have been, in visual word recognition, there have been two theories regarding how orthographic input units map onto phonological output units. And one theory suggests that a string of single letters or a string of letter clusters corresponds to a string of single phonemes. But the other theory suggests that a string of single letters or letter clusters corresponds to coarser phonological units such as onsets and rhymes. So these theories have been critical for the implementation of coding schemes in computational models of reading. And so, for example, in the DSC model, there is a letter coding scheme, whereas in the triangle model by Plaut et al., there is a non-set coding scheme. So this is a quite nice thing to investigate using the mode. So what we did was to use primes and targets that started with the same letter but had a different onset. So the onset of disc, does everyone know what an onset is? It's everything that comes before the vowel. So here the primes and the targets, so disc, the onset of disc is D, the onset of drum is dr. So the primes and the targets start with the same letter always, but they start with a different onset. Okay? And so in a theory that assumes an onset coding scheme, these conditions here should not yield faster naming latencies than the unrelated condition, because what matters is the onset, not the common letter. But DRC, in the DRC model, it's a letter coding scheme, and so this is what the model predicts, that there should be prime in these conditions. So we ran this experiment, and we found that it was indeed the case, that it was the common letter that mattered, and not the common onset. We did exactly the same experiment with non-words. We found exactly the same result. So what we conclude in that paper is that it looks like the human reading system represents complex onsets as separate letters and phonemes, and not as whole units. Okay, so to summarize all the reading aloud studies, I think that what we can say is that our reading system consists of a non-lexical reading mechanism that operates serially and from left to right, translating print into sound on a letter-by-letter basis. And these are other empirical findings around the MOB, which I found throughout my PhD, but obviously I'm not going to talk about all of them. Now, I presented the ones that have important theoretical implications for theories of reading, but I also did many studies that had just implementational implications. So, for example, I had two different versions of the DRC model that could equally simulate the MOB, but the way the non-lexical route moved in one model was different from the way the non-lexical route moved in the other model. And so I ran an experiment just to adjudicate between the two different versions. And we kept the version that could simulate the human data. But I'm not going to be talking about that today. So that brings me to the second part of my talk. So this is all about computational modeling of reading aloud. And I'm going to talk about some of the limitations of present models. So one serious limitation of all models up until now has been that they can only handle monosyllables. But these only constitute 10% of English words, and in other languages, practically monosyllables do not exist. The CDP plus model came out only a couple of years ago, and this model at least can handle the syllabic word reading. This is something that we are currently working on in this project. So you have mentioned it. This is a Liberation Trust funded project. And we are, the aim of this project is to combine behavioral, neuropsychological, and computational modeling methods to investigate how people read multisyllabic words.
What did you say that? Say that again, would you please, what you just said?
Sorry?
What did you just say? You said it's a...
It's a Liberation Trust funded project.
Yes, I understand that.
Yeah.
You said it's a combination of behavioural...
Behavioral.
Neuropsychological... Okay, that's not... What's... Okay.
We're looking at stress assignment and how people, we're starting off with a mega study that looks at non-word reading, multisyllabic non-word reading, and what cues people use to assign stress to non-words, multisyllabic non-words, and how they pronounce them. Because the first thing we want to do is to derive some generalizations about what people do, and then we're going to do further work with simple experiments.
So what methodologies are you using?
We're going to have like a mega study, like simple reading aloud.
Yeah.
We are planning to turn DRC into a multisyllabic model, and we're going to do some studies with dyslexics. Territory is going to do those, Swansea, to look at people that have surface dyslexics that cannot correctly assign stress, for example, and how they deal with reading aloud words and non-words.
So what are the methods you're going to use then? You're going to use...
Computational modeling, to standard reaction time measures, and
So the behavioural stuff is RTs?
RTs, yeah. Computational modeling. These projects are started, so it started in September. There's a postdoc I'm not going to talk about this today. And I'm just going to just mention about the second important limitation which I've been working on. Now this is a limitation of most computation models of single word reading, that the semantic system has not been implemented. And of course, semantic influence appears to be null or minimal in single word reading, and therefore most computational models of single word reading have been able to simulate all of the empirical findings reported in the literature in the absence of the implementation of the semantic route. However, we know that semantic properties of words do affect reading performance in skilled adult readers. And a very neat example, I think, is that there are imageability effects in reading aloud. I don't know if you're familiar with these particular effects. Basically, low frequency, inconsistent words that are highly imageable, for example, comb, are read aloud much faster than words with the same characteristics that are low imageable, such as dead. And so Williams, for example, did this study where she used just consistent and inconsistent words, and what she found that the words that were low in imageability, high imageable words were read much faster than the low imageable words. And so what the assumption was that there is semantic influence, and so because of semantic mediation, this is why the effect occurs. And what she hypothesized was that if you de-emphasize the influence of semantics in your task, if the locus of the effect is actually semantic, these imageability effects should disappear or reduced. And how do you do that? Well, one way of doing it is just by including non-words in your task. So instead of just asking people to read aloud words, you ask them to read the list of words and non-words. And what she found was that the effect indeed disappeared.
So that, if you've got to read non-words, that you're saying that reduces the semantic component of the task. Is that what you're saying?
That was her hypothesis, and so she carried out a second experiment, and she found that the effect got abolished when she included the non-words in the task. And so what we've now done is that we have implemented the semantic route in the DRC model. And so for every word in the DRC vocabulary now there is a semantic unit, and so the semantic system contains approximately 8,000 units. And now this model can in principle do color naming, picture naming, and a lot of other tasks. So what effects can we simulate? Well, conventional and phonological strip, for example, anomic aphasia, picture word interference effects, the mobile picture naming. So this is instead of having prime target letter strings, the target is a picture, and what has been found in that is that if the target picture starts with a sound that is the same as the prime word, target picture naming labels are going to be faster compared to an unrelated condition. And obviously imageability effects in reading aloud. So at the moment I have managed to simulate the mode in picture naming, and I'm currently working on the imageability effects. Simon, you just worked out, so I just said that we have implemented a DRC model with a semantic route. So these are the effects that can be simulated. Now, the assumption here with the imageability effects is that if the frequency is low and they are inconsistent in terms of the orthography to phonology mappings, the semantic influence is going to be greater. But this is not a foregone conclusion, so actual simulations will tell us whether this is so, and I think that this is why doing the simulation is going to be very informative about when the effects arise.
Can you say a little bit more about how you actually implemented this method?
Yeah, I recently received the final model on Friday, so I haven't looked at it in detail. but we have implemented imageability ratings. We use the imageability ratings of Otis et al.
Okay.
And we implemented them in the same way that frequency is implemented in the model.
Okay.
We used exactly the same procedure.
So you have like local nodes that
Yes,
represent
yeah.
semantic features.
It's basically for every single word.
There's a node representing its semantic content,
Yeah.
and that's weighted by some weight factor that is.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So how do you capture the relationships between words?
The relationship.
Like, say, cat and dog. So, you know, if there's a linkage.
Yeah. Well, we haven't looked at that. It's
Okay.
just this is like really we just started.
No, sure, I'm not
Yeah.
criticizing it. I'm
Yeah,
just
so we
wondering.
haven't, like the only thing that I actually tried to simulate was the moving picture naming, and the next one that I'm trying to do is the imageability effects in reading aloud. But yeah, I mean, initially I said, we can simulate everything that has been found in all of the semantic effects that have been found in reading aloud, but this is like a really big job.
Yeah,
I'm not
sure.
gonna be able to
So
do.
running these simulations, though, you typically will like clamp these units on, and they propagate activation back into the
Yeah.
lexicons,
Yeah,
and then that's how you get the priming effects.
yeah.
Okay.
So, I mean, I'm quite interested in this. I'm interested in the semantic level, if
Mhm.
you like. So, I mean, is there any scope? So one of the projects we've got going is looking at semantic neighbourhood density.
Mm.
Right. Is there any scope in this implementation to capture things like that?
Yeah, I wouldn't be
It's
able to
too-
respond. Yeah, it's too early.
It's too
And
early.
actually, I mean, I haven't really worked with this model. I simulated the moving picture naming on Friday, and then I was hoping that I would be able to present some simulation to the imageability effects, but I just didn't have time.
That's fine.
So it's really,
Yeah.
it's brand new.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to pass now to the third major limitation. I'm going to devote the rest of my time to this because this is what my BA project is about, basically. A major limitation of all computational models of single word reading is that they have absolutely nothing to say about the processes that mediate the activation of abstract phonological code and their articulatory implementation in speech. So if you look at these models, these processes are represented by a simple arrow that goes from the phoneme level to speech. Okay. But obviously we know that there are many things happening here. Okay. Now, in part, the reason for this is because these processes, to some extent, have been accounted for by models of speech production. And models of reading aloud, models of reading aloud have been treated separately for models of speech production. That has been the tradition. However, if we think that the initiation of articulation occurs at the processing stage that is common to reading aloud and speech production, then actually these processes should also be accounted for by models of reading aloud. And so this is what my current project is looking at. I'm going to just read to you this quote by Bob, which is basically, she wrote this quote for models of speech production, but I think it also applies to models of reading aloud. So the properties of the verbal responses themselves and the processes that produce them may receive little attention beyond the contributions of a globally characterized response stage or a box in an information processing flow chart that is labeled output. And I think this very well conveys the message about how underspecified these processes are in models of single word reading. So the first study that I did, I mean, this was planned to be like a really spin-off study, but it now turns out to be like a really big study. It was motivated by some work that Kevin Roon did at the University of New York. So Kevin did his PhD there, and he came to Royal Holloway last year, and he talked us through his PhD work. And basically what he did was to, he had participants hear syllables such as ba, da, ga, and and they had to produce syllables that either said the same articulator, such as pa when they had ba, or ta when they had da, or they...
Hang on.
Yeah.
I couldn't tell any difference between those two. Wait a minute. Pa, they've got to produce ba,
So do you hear
and
ba?
not da.
Yeah. So
But
you,
they all sound the same to me.
so you hear ba, and you either have to produce pa, the aspirated, or ta. Okay. So if you look at these two, so these ba and pa share their articulation because they're both produced with the lips,
Oh.
right?
It's not the R sound then, it's the
Oh, no, it's the, yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
I understand, sorry.
So these one are both produced with the lips, right? Whereas
Yeah,
these
and
ones
ta.
produced with the tip of the tongue, the ta one.
and ta, I can see that.
Yeah.
I've got it.
So basically that's what he did, and what he found was that the naming latencies were faster when the response and the distractor shared an articulator. So basically they said all features except voicing. Yeah?
Yeah.
So what he concluded from this study was that models of speech production should also include a level of representation that represents the features, not only single phonemes. That was the conclusion from this study. And so what I thought was that if this feature level of representation was necessary in models of reading aloud, we should be able to find similar effects in reading aloud, right? So this is a very easy study to do using the MOE again. So this is the typical MOE paradigm, right? But then you can include a condition where the prime and the target share all phonetic features except voicing.
That's pretty good,
Yeah. So we did this experiment, and obviously this is something that if we found this effect, so that if this condition yielded faster naming latencies than the unrelated condition, models of reading aloud would not be able to explain these findings because they don't have phonetic feature level representation, right? So we carried out the experiment with primes presented for 50 milliseconds, and we found no effect. So then we thought, okay, can we conclude that there is no phonetic feature activation in reading aloud? Well, we thought that maybe 50 milliseconds is not enough time for people to process this level of features, the feature level. And so we thought, okay, what will happen if we slightly increase the prime duration? So we increased the prime duration to 60 milliseconds, and we ran the experiment. And then we got a very nice effect of 9 milliseconds. So feature priming effects arose, and we were very happy about it. And we also suggested, we found a significant interaction between the two experiments. And so what we suggested was that models of single word reading should include a feature level of representation.
Okay, so
Yeah.
I've got a question. I mean, this is a question now. So if you go back on slide,
Yep.
why did you, I mean, you know, at a superficial level, I completely understand that you wanted to give them more time to try to, for the prime to be influential. I understand it at that level. But why did you pick 10 milliseconds?
Oh, it was
why
just...
Why not 20? Why not 40?
Yeah,
Right? I mean,
in the mass
you know.
priming, I'll tell you why. I mean, in the mass priming literature, what has been said is that if you increase the prime, if you present for more than 60 milliseconds, it becomes visible.
yeah.
And therefore, they typically present the primes for between 30 and 60 milliseconds.
Sure.
So we thought that 60 is the maximum we
Okay.
can get. That's why we present for 60.
So you wouldn't have done it, if that hadn't have worked, you wouldn't have done it at 70?
I wouldn't have done it because actually I did, when I was doing my PhD, I tried manipulating prime duration. So I used 50, 70, 90, and you get a lot of errors over 70 milliseconds because people actually see the prime and start producing the prime
Yeah.
instead of the target.
Yeah.
So I wouldn't go beyond 70. But it also, it depends on the person, so there are many individual differences there. So even with 60 milliseconds, some people say, oh, they're clearly, I can see some letters there, and sometimes I get confused. And other people, you ask them that explicitly, did you see anything coming before? They say, no.
No, I
So
understand that.
it's really,
I mean, it seems to me that this is a non-trivial aspect of isolated word recognition that's always glossed over. I mean, I've had all this off Ken 40 years ago, we published the isolated word recognition stuff I did with Jane Hinton, and I mean, you know, there's this golden rule of 60 milliseconds and no more, and if you're using a forward mask with 60 milliseconds, then we don't think you can see the words, but it's absolute nonsense because there's incredible variability from subject to subject. But so I understand that and I agree with you, but what I guess what I was trying to, and I think your argument about, look, 60 milliseconds is the most we can go to because of this unwritten rule that exists in isolated word recognition, let's call it word nerd literature, then, you know, I get that, but I was just wondering if, you know, there was something magic about the 10 millisecond value.
oh yeah, no, it wasn't.
So if you'd have done that with, let's say, a 30 millisecond prime duration and got the effect rather than 50, would you have still gone right up to 60, or would you
Actually,
have
no,
it up?
the original idea was to do it just with 50. I thought that, I'm sure if Ken has found these effects, I mean, I'm going to be able to find it at 50.
Yeah.
And then I thought of leaving it there, and then we sort of started thinking about it, and then I said, okay, there is room to go a little bit more and try with 60. But I really did not expect to find the effect at 60, because I thought initially I was going to find the 50, if it's not there, I'm going to find it. Now, the thing is that we submitted this paper, and the reviewers asked us to try to replicate, because they were not happy with the 9 millisecond effect. They said that it was a very small effect, and they basically asked us to control for everything in the stimuli. And so it's taken months to find the new set of stimuli, and we are now trying to replicate. So that was, it wasn't, the paper wasn't rejected, but they said you can only resubmit it if you can replicate your findings. So that's what we are currently doing. And actually, because we have changed computers now in the lab, I can't get the same refresh rate, and I have to present the stimuli for 58.8 milliseconds, so it's going to be a little bit lower.
I would be very interested to know whether you successfully replicate your effects, because when we did our stuff, I mean, this is years ago, right? But when we did our isolated word stuff, we published some work, but then when we came to, we did some follow-up research, right? And these experiments, we did the experiments originally on the original kit, and then Jane moved institutions, and so she tried to set up, but she couldn't get the same kit. And when we started using the new kit, we couldn't get the effects to replicate.
Yeah.
It really was problematic.
Yeah.
And if you're going to use new kit, I wonder whether I think a lot of these things are kind of tied to a monitor.
But I'm actually worried about that, because at some point I thought, okay, let's take back the computers and put them back in the lab, and we try to use exactly the same computer. But then I think this is not good, because what are people in other labs? People in our lab is not going to have the same kit as you. And for example, with the mode, it's such a robust effect that people like in 5 different languages have replicated, many different labs, and that's what you want. You don't want to publish something and then nobody else can
So it will
replicate.
be interesting to see whether you replicate this.
Yeah, well, I'm hoping we will, because otherwise, obviously, these data are unpublishable. So.
Can I ask you a question about kind of the motivation for doing the modeling? So just kind of bumping up a level. So I don't disagree with anything you said, and I think it's, you know, a worthwhile endeavor to try to understand kind of the mind in its entirety, and to have a formal model of what happens when people do tasks like this. But at the same time, it seems like you're getting further and further removed from what most people would think about when they think about a reading, natural reading, in the sense that you're adding this layer of complexity on the production end that really is designed to account for findings related to naming aloud and specific phenomena like the vote phenomenon.
Yeah.
Right, as opposed to natural reading of extended discourse.
But at the same time, if you think about it, when I speak to people from speech production, the tasks that they're using are always reading aloud. They don't like using repetition tasks, because it's been found that when you hear way it is being produced when you hear it. And so they have discarded these methods. They don't use repetition tasks anymore. And most of them use reading aloud.
Of
And
single
then-
words.
Yes, and then they generalize to speech production. And it's funny because they use reading aloud tasks and they say nothing about reading processes. So they speak about speech production. We do reading aloud and we say nothing about speech production. And I think it's pretty unfortunate that two areas are so related. Nevertheless, they are treated completely separately, as in, like within completely different disciplines. So I mean, this is one of the motivations why for doing this experiment that we are moving towards a comprehensive model of reading aloud and speech production.
Okay.
I mean, I think that Eric's got a very, very good point here. I mean, I guess that, and I mean, I'm not meaning to have a go, because I don't, you know, if I want to have a go, I have a go. I'm not meaning to have a go. but what I think is, you know, if you take the first half of your talk, I mean, it's really good. It's really interesting. And I like this stuff as well. I think it's really good. But it feels to me like the whole priming and the whole of the priming approach is merely an approximation to a parafoveal preview. You know, which we know happens in reading, normal reading. And it's, you know, back in the days when we couldn't do decent eye tracking experiments and look at natural reading, I understand why that came about and why we studied it then, but we can now. And so it feels like these effects that you're interested in, very, very interesting by the way, you know, really good, but they really directly come from normal reading. You know, I mean, I assume that you would like to say, look, my effects generalise to normal reading. And if that's the case, again, not wishing to put you quite on the spot, right? And this is more just an informed discussion. I mean, why, and this stuff, right, I could almost see that this will be like asking a child to read aloud. You know, when they're reading in the classroom, you often hear them reading a book and they'll read aloud before they become, you know, really good silent readers. And so it feels to me like the natural extension of this is to consider exactly these issues that you're identifying, but in the context of more natural reading rather than this artificial isolated word recognition. You know, I mean, when, you know, in your life, when did you last read 50 single words on their own? The last time you did a lexical decision experiment. That's true, right? I can bet you 50 quid in this room that what I've just said is true. When did you last read something? Every time you read something, you're reading it naturally, and so it just feels like, and I think it's great, right? But it just feels to me like, almost like, you're almost approximating this thing when you don't need to. I mean, it's very relevant via parafoveal preview. The priming stuff you're doing, it just seems to me that's essentially an implementation of preview, right? You're getting something before you actually fixate it and really get on with processing it. It's a fuzzy kind of subliminal, you know, approximation of what you ultimately will look at very clearly.
But, okay, I'm going to take a little bit stronger stance. So I still think I agree with what you said, and I think it's really interesting, but I still think it's an open question as to whether or not you find these effects of speech production on something like eye movements.
Yeah.
Right.
No, that is an open question.
And in the context of this type of task, you demonstrated it. But suppose we were to do the task using lexical decision. Would you find these types of effects there?
Yeah, I mean, that's the other thing that only a couple of weeks ago I came across a paper which was published in Cognition. It's a 2001 paper, and they actually found phonetic feature priming effects in the lexical decision task.
Okay.
And I thought, okay, well, at least they haven't found them in the reading aloud task, then, you know, that would be all, I wouldn't even bother doing the replication of this experiment, but they have found them in lexical decision.
Okay.
So, to be honest, I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to replicate. Like, you know, this is the first step, I think. But then, at the same time, I guess if you find effects in lexical decision, you can't find them reading aloud. I really cannot explain why.
I would have predicted the opposite, actually.
Just like you find them in lexical decision and not reading aloud.
No, I would expect to find them in reading aloud.
Oh, yeah, exactly.
Because you're only exploiting the
exactly.
speech production of the thing.
Exactly, that's what I was
Whereas lexical
thinking.
decision, you don't need to have
Yeah.
instruction at all.
So that's what I'm saying. So if I let's say if I tried to do a lexical decision experiment and I did find defects there, but I can't replicate my own findings,
Right.
then I have no explanation for this.
Right.
So that's the other thing.
I mean, at some level, it seems then, I'm thinking about that lexical, I mean, that lexical decision result, does that not suggest that there's almost some incredibly automated linkage between orthography and phonology that you just can't turn it off?
Well, I mean, there are people out there that suggest that you just use phonology to do a lexical decision task. I mean,
But on the input side, not the output side.
Yeah.
They make a distinction
Yeah,
between the two, right?
yeah. So this was one of the studies that I did, but I'm just going to finish off with what I'm currently doing. So as I mentioned before, the broad aim of my BA project is to look at the relationship between the computation of abstract codes for sounds and their articulatory implementation. And this is very relevant to computational models of reading aloud for another reason. Now, these models assume that variables that are known to affect higher cognitive levels, for example, lexical frequency, affect the speed of computation of a phonological code. But they make the assumption that these variables are not going to affect the articulation of that phonological code. So once you have selected the phonological code, then this frequency, for example, word frequency, is not going to affect how you're going to produce, how you're going to execute your response. However, there is a lot of empirical evidence from many different domains showing that these variables that are known to affect higher cognitive levels also affect the execution of the motor response. And some of this evidence comes from the manual domain. So one of the very first studies that was done on this was a lexical decision task. So you've got participants, you show participants words and non-words, and they have to decide whether real words or non-words. And what they ask people to do is to move a joystick towards one side if it is a real word, and towards the other side if it is a non-word. Not only they found that participants' responses were faster, and I've got to say that the words comprised of high-frequency words and low-frequency words. And not only they found that participants' reaction times were faster for high-frequency words, but also the acceleration of the response was greater, the force was greater, and the duration of the response, so how long it took them to move the joystick towards the side, was shorter when the words were high in frequency. So they concluded that actually variables that everybody has thought only affect higher cognitive levels, they can affect your execution, the execution of the response.
Well, okay, yeah, I mean, I understand that's what they
Yeah,
found,
yeah.
but I mean, you know, when you press a button in a lexical decision experiment, I'm assuming all of those things will be true then, it'll just be a slightly less, overt action, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, why is that a big deal?
Well, because it shows that, I mean, there is a big debate about whether the nature of processing is staged or cascaded. So there are many theories that assume that once you have made your selection, that's not going to affect the stage further down.
Yeah.
Whereas if it is cascaded, then it's going to trickle all the way down to affect your actual response. So there's this big debate in the literature, and I think this study is addressed mainly this debate. Now another study in this domain was with mouse trajectories. I think you probably know about that because the same was done with eye movements. So people had a word like candle, and they had to pick the picture that corresponded to the word they had. So they had to move the mouse towards the target picture. And so in the control condition, they had a distractor which was phonologically dissimilar to the target word. So this would be jacket. And in the related condition, they had a phonologically similar distractor, which is candy. Okay. What they found was that the movement, the mouse trajectories were curved towards the distractor when it was phonologically similar to the target word compared to the control condition. And in the eye movement literature, they did exactly the same, but they asked people, they said, okay, pick up the candle, and they had a candy, and what they showed is that saccades, there were saccades towards candy, but not towards jacket, for example, which was phonologically similar to the target picture. And they did this experiment with adults, with bilinguals, with children, and they always found the same thing. And also from verbal responses, there is some evidence. In this study, participants had to say out loud the color of the square. So the correct answer here would be red. And they had a congruent condition where the word red was printed on the top of the square, incongruent condition and neutral condition. What they found was that color naming latencies were slower in the incongruent condition compared to the other two, but also the response duration. So saying red, the whole duration of the response was prolonged in the incongruent condition compared to the other two. And what they concluded was that semantic variables can affect the actual execution of the verbal response. But Damien failed to replicate these, and he did several studies, picture-word inference studies, and he couldn't find this effect. So I'm just going to finish here, but to say that I'm now looking at how these variables such as word frequency, neighborhood density, that are known to affect the computation of phonological codes, how they can also affect articulatory processes. And up until now, I've only used reaction times and acoustic measures, so measuring phoneme durations. But I've now been in touch with the people in Edinburgh, and I'm going to start using ultrasound to look at the actual articulation.
Who are you doing that with?
Jim Scobie and Alice Turk in Edinburgh, because we've got an EPG system, but it looks like ultrasound is becoming very popular and is a good technique to use to look at articulatory processes. So I'm moving now in that domain. So that's pretty much it.